Hi, and thank you again for joining this channel. You'll find in this video some discussion about remote pair programming and pair programming in general that I had with Damien, and I think they are very interesting if you want to learn more about remote pair programming and pair programming in general. So stay tuned, and if you want to watch the full video, you can find it on my YouTube channel.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate having a chance to pair program with you. And the coolest thing is we can actually teach others as well and help them, maybe. So I've been working remotely for a company for the last 3 years, basically, full time. And during this time, my team is mostly doing pair programming, which is why I find your show so nice, because it really thinks about how can you do the pair programming like in a team. And I have some experience with it. I use it almost daily. And although my personal favorite IDE is IntelliJ, for the pair programming, there's VS Code, which has this live share extension, and I found that it actually revolutionizes the way I do pair programming, because it allows very quick switching, almost as if you were sitting in the same location. And since I use it all the time in my work, I thought, why not just show it?
If you explain a bit what we're gonna do, it's Visual Studio Code. I tried it a bit, it didn't work for me, but now you made some magic and it works. So what's so nice about it with remote pairing?
Yeah, I think what, so when this came before this VS Code came about, I think the way I would pair program with my colleagues was that usually we would have like, someone has the IDE and then we write the code and then the person pushes the code when you switch. We would use screen sharing most of the time, and then the other person starts a screen share, right? And there's quite some friction in the switching of the screen sharing and like the IDE and checking out the code and so on. So what this led to is us not changing as frequently as we would do when we were sitting in a normal office. So when this VS Code thing came around, we tried it, and immediately we noticed that it allows for us to have way quicker switching between the people. And so what it does for us is it basically creates a session in which many people can join. I've done sessions with up to like 10 people. And that worked also quite well. Although I'm realizing I'm doing a little bit of marketing now, which I don't intend to do anyway. As I said, it's not my IDE of choice, but for the pair programming, it works well. So what's cool about it is we can, first of all, see the cursor of the other person. So if I select something that I want to talk about, you can see that I'm highlighting it. It also, like if I add like a compilation error here or something, you get the same compile errors. So both of us can see that in our IDE and investigate. You can also see that at the bottom here, we have this test runner running, which basically is a shared terminal. So all the code lives on my machine. The tests are being run on my machine, yet you can still see all the output of the test running, which I think is quite cool, because you can make changes and we both can see the same like tests running basically. And yeah, it takes a while because of the screen sharing. My computer is a little bit overloaded, but generally this is quite fast. The other nice thing is I can also share servers. So on my computer, I have a watch task, which is basically taking all of this, bundling these things, compiling them, and then putting them onto a server, which is living on port 1234. And I managed to share it with you basically. And so now you can go to your server.
So if we go back,
browser.
This is my browser, this is the server, and it lives on your machine, but I can call it through the IDE, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can see it via like port forwarding, basically, some internal magic. The interesting bit is if you now go to your editor and you make a change to like the positions, I think you would go to the index.ts file.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's go to the index.txt file. Yeah, and
you can see some coordinates there. So if you change some of the coordinates.
So this would be, I don't know, 150.
Yep. And if you go back to your browser with a little bit of time, you can see the changes reflecting. So what's really cool is all the building and compilation happens on my machine, yet you can still see it. And that is true for the tests and also the results, which means we can both always test and we don't have to use screen sharing because we can fluently switch. And this really enables the strong start pairing idea where there's one driver and one navigator, and we fluently switch all the time between the two roles. And it's quite easy to do. There's one really cool feature, which is the following. So a big source of friction would be if I would always tell you, now go to this file and then go to this file and so on. Luckily, we don't need to do this. On the left-hand side, you see my name with a little circle. And if that circle is not filled, basically, it means that you just scroll around and you don't do anything. But if it is a filled circle, it means you're following me. So now I can click onto some file, and you can see the IDE jumping around and following my cursor, which is really nice if for the driver, because the driver then can type, and the navigator will always see what the driver is. And I have exactly the same feature. Sometimes this leads to really weird situations when both of us follow each other around. Then it gets stuck in like a crazy loop sometimes, but let's not worry about this too much for now.
But it's also good because you can do parallel things. So maybe sometimes you don't want to do driver navigator, you just want to do setup or something, and we can parallelize, and it makes things faster. So I can do part of it, you can do part of it, and instead of taking 10 minutes, maybe it takes 5. So I think that's also true. Nice.
Or repeated kernel things. So sometimes we would find, like if you do a refactoring or something, you need to go to all these places, or the linter is not happy or whatever, then you can kind of like parallelize working on the on the files. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, so I would suggest, just because I'm more familiar with the language, basically, with TypeScript, that I start as the driver, meaning I'm going to be typing, but I cannot come up with any ideas on my own, although I can have, of course, opinions. But you can treat me as a smart keyboard, I guess, right? Where you give me voice commands, and I try to turn those voice commands as smartly as I can into code. Sometimes, as it is with, like with these things like Siri and so on, they sometimes go a bit wrong. So I'm the same. And basically, you're the navigator. Which means you say what we're going to write, and then we switch this role every now and then, but we'll start with you navigating. And lastly, I always had problems with the separation of driver and navigator. I could never remember which is which until someone told me where the metaphor comes from, which is driving a car.
Exactly.
So the person, yeah, exactly. So the driver is steering while the navigator holds the map and says kind of where to go. So.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea. And I think it also applies to anywhere where you need to pair, where you have a bit of complexity, like airplanes. You have a driver and a navigator. Well, you have a commander and a first officer. Yeah, commander and first officer. So it's the same thing.
As on the tooling, I think what is interesting is, the delays actually made this really bad. So we talked about this earlier. The trade-offs between speed and having a good tool to do the refactoring is now, instead of a win-lose or a lose-win, became a lose-lose. So we have neither of both of them.
Yeah.
What I find really cool is that although we never programmed anything together, we can still talk about these things, right? So we can actually have like all this rich language and talk about the concept and be quite effective in problem solving. And although you didn't know TypeScript, it wasn't a problem. We thought about the problem and not about the programming language, I think. Those are the three main things, I think. How about you?
Yeah, I think it helps a lot having one of the partners know how the language works and how the environment works. Otherwise, it's just losing time. I like the tool, the Visual Studio Code, because it helps you with this remote pairing without sharing the screen, and we can both very easily switch. It's very nice from this point of view. It's not nice because for you it's very easy to see the auto completion, to see the tests and so on. So partially it's doing its work, but for what I've been doing until now with remote pair programming, I think it's the best I've tried. It's not ideal, it's not nice for lags, and it's not nice for having the lack of refactoring.
Yeah, that's true. Because we think about lines of text all the time instead of the higher level concepts, right? Which is like extract method. These things have names and we should be able to just make the tool do it. I agree.
And it doesn't help me with some situations like when I had the double name, the same name put in twice. It didn't show up like I'm used to in other IDEs. And so it's not that helpful from this point of view as an IDE, but it's really helpful from the point of view of remote pairing. So again, as you said, you win some, you lose some, I don't know. Yeah, I think as well that we could pair up easily. Sometimes, quite often, in last months, people ask me, "How do you pair up with these people? Did you work with them? How do you do that?" And it feels strange, or it seems strange for many people that you can pair up with someone you don't know and still be kind of productive. I'm curious about your views about that. Why does this happen? Because you do remote pairing, you've worked in teams. Why do you think that can happen, or sometimes it doesn't happen? Sometimes you're very unproductive with some people when you do pairing.
I think there's a lot about the context, right? Or like that everyone has. So the more shared context you have, the easier it is to do something. So for example, right, like communication can never be perfect and it always relies on the context. The more shared context you have, the easier communication is, which is why doctors, for example, have like names for all the bones so that they don't always have to describe here the bone that is attached to the one from here and so on. Yeah. And I think the way you reach out to people is quite interesting, right? You ask if people who are interested in doing this with you on Twitter. So people need to have heard about you and they probably will know about most of the topics you're discussing, or to some extent, although not everything. So I think you immediately, by the way you attract people, you don't get random programmers from all over the world. You get a certain kind of people from a community, and I think it's reinforcing itself, these connections. And I think this is why we have a strong shared context, right? And this is why it works. In a work environment, very often you work with someone who comes from a very different background, especially if one of you is new, and then it might not work as well. That's my theory. It might be completely wrong, but
yeah. So that's a very good point, that we have a kind of a self-selecting audience, and I think people who watch this need to understand that it's not always like that. Pair programming can be difficult, can be annoying, can be frustrating, and it can be quite messy sometimes. You need to take a break, or sometimes even you have conflicts because of that.
Yeah, I think it's the funny thing about pair programming. What I like so much is it's almost like it reveals those problems. You can choose to work together without pairing, right? And then you don't notice that you have the problems. So the interesting part is it better to discover early on via pair programming that you have these teamwork, trust issues, whatever, right? Or these strong opinions. With pair programming, you discover them way easier, whereas otherwise you might see flame wars on like pull request reviews, right? And this is not the same way of discovering, or like it just takes longer. So if you value feedback, then, or like learning a lot, then I think the pair programming is great. And what we haven't done, we went 1.5 hours straight as well. So the advice I always give to my mentees, basically, when they start out pair programming, is to use a timer like the Pomodoro technique,
and take a break.
Force breaks every 15 minutes. Go away for 5 minutes and breathe and see. And what we've done is basically, I think, based on our experience. Although I really could use a break now too.
Yeah. That's what I said in the end. I said I couldn't type anymore, and I said it's obvious that I need a break. So probably because I do this and I'm used to that, I can take a break every 1.5 hours. I wouldn't recommend that to many people. So your advice is very sane. Just take 25 minutes work, 5 minutes break, and then take a longer break after 3 sessions. That's the Pomodoro technique. It works great. There are symptoms that you need to take a break. Start making silly mistakes.
That's a good point. Yeah. No, excellent. I really enjoyed this session. Thanks for taking the time, for doing all the work of the setup. I just had to click some buttons, but you do all the composition of all the streams. So thanks for that.